All right. Well, thanks so much for joining me on Thinking Machines, AI and Philosophy. Dr. Derrick Hull has a background in psychology going quite a ways back. So Derrick has a doctorate in psychology from Columbia, worked as VP and R&D at Talkspace, also at Noom, Mindbloom, Hero Journey Club, probably a bunch of other places along the way. And Derrick and I, as of very recently, have started working together. We super happy to have you on here.
It's been my pleasure. It really is a dream, actually. How cool to be working on this project.
Well, let's talk about that. I mean, I know that you're very excited about the idea of AI and therapy. I guess I just want to start by asking, what is therapy?
Let's start with the easy question. Gosh, I mean, there's so many answers that could be given to what is therapy, because a lot of it depends on orientation, a person's background, your take on the human condition. But I think, how do you even get started? So you can always go to the etymology, right? What does therapy mean? So therapy is related to a Greek word for healing. So in a broadest sense, you could say therapy is a process of healing. And I think that's broad enough that most folks would agree with that.
And I guess these days the term also means aromatherapy and
A physical therapy, yeah, I mean, it can mean lots of different things. It's any kind of process that somebody goes through to move from a condition of suffering to hopefully a condition with less suffering. I don't know that we completely eliminate suffering, but
yeah,
to have less.
that's a great answer.
Yeah, I mean, that's a very broad answer, but depending on, one's orientation, therapy can mean very different things.
Yeah.
In jest, Freud called being, well, in his terms, a psychoanalyst, the impossible profession. So if we think about what is therapy, what is a therapist, he certainly felt the profession to be very challenging. But for some folks, therapy is about,
Why is it an impossible profession?
for Freud, well, because he felt like there are conflicts and contradictions within the human psyche that are profoundly difficult to completely, unravel. And I think later in his career in particular, sometimes people don't want to get better. One assumption we make is that everybody, of course, wants to feel better, but some folks get stuck into patterns where that's hard for them to imagine what it's like to feel better. And there's a variety of other things that he would have said about that.
I guess there's something interesting here about the dichotomy where, there's some element of like psycho quote unquote analysis outside of the like Freudian meaning of the term of like, you want to understand people. Like people, I would imagine someone like you might go into psychology not merely to help people, but also because you're just curious to understand some stuff. And clearly Freud cared about understanding some stuff beyond helping people. And then there's the element of like, can we help people independently of whether or not we understand them?
For sure. There's also, and this is only a half joke too in the profession, called the wounded healer, which is that, the old like research is me search kind of idea, that people go to the profession because they're like, I don't know what's going on with me. So if I can try to figure out what's going on for me, then maybe I can leverage that information to help others.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing you and I love to talk about when it comes to psychology as it relates to AI is just like actually a lot of modern AI has been inspired by, psychological and more importantly, neuroscience research, right? Whether the exact nature of this is like complicated, but a lot of the major early AI research was actually coming from people studying the brain. Like Jeffrey Hinton was, deeply integrated with that whole neuroscience world and trying to understand what we can infer and learn for AI. I mean, how do you feel about the idea of AI as inspired by the brain?
I love the idea. And I think vice versa. The person that comes to mind for me is Frank Rosenblatt, who wrote that very important paper on perceptrons. And Rosenblatt was not like a machine learning expert. He was a psychologist who was just interested in what are these little units inside the head? How do these units together process information and make decisions? And as he started thinking about what that would be like, the perceptron was born. Now, of course, nobody uses perceptrons anymore. The architectures are much more sophisticated.
But it's honestly not too different. We've just made it a little bit more computationally efficient, but realistically, people still refer to neural networks as multi-layer perceptrons.
All right.
No, it's semi-accurate.
I'm glad it's still around.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it leads to a lot of interesting questions around, understanding neural nets, understanding minds. Like, are there analogies? I think I was chatting with you, and and we were laughing before about the question, like, could you do therapy on an AI? Will we end up doing therapy on AI? And you, like I said, you can make that argument. I don't know. Do you think that, like, is there any truth to the idea, or is there anything interesting to the thought experiment about like, will we start going in the opposite direction and practicing the same psychological principles, not just neuroscientific principles that we practice on humans towards AI?
Mm. I mean, I think if we set aside the questions of would or should we do therapy with AI, and let's just ask, could we? I mean, in a way, if we were to try to characterize a lot of the challenges that people come to therapy with, it's often because they're feeling stuck in their life in some way, right? There's ways in which they're understanding situations or even sometimes unknowingly creating situations that they see over and over. It's this kind of pattern in their life. And if we think about that in statistical terms, right, there's a term called overfitting, where a model takes a too narrow range of data that then is hard to generalize to new situations. And I think in a way, one could understand therapy as a way of bringing in more data to try to fight the overfitting in somebody's own patterns. So in a way, so this is me making the argument, right?
Impressive. Yeah, I give you
So if I try to make an argument, like if in a way, anytime you're training an AI to have more generalized behavior, that's kind of therapy
Yeah.
for an AI anyway.
I actually really like that analogy. I mean, I was thinking more on the side of like, we actually do try to diagnose weird behaviors with AI. There's this, I know we've spoken about sparse autoencoders, which has been like a big trend in the AI world these days, which is like, can we understand neural networks by trying to map the activations, which is basically like how neurons are activating essentially to different kinds of behaviors. And we know just like in a brain, there are tiny brains of like worms that have 300 neurons and are capable of a lot of complexity. Human brains are neurons, each individually can do a lot of different things. They're not necessarily focused on one thing, but maybe we can actually map, some activations to a more sparse space to identify like all the different things going on. Anyway, skipping past all the details, we have been able to uncover responsibility of specific neurons in neural networks that are responsible for certain activity. Do you think that there's, a world of, future of psychology where we actually start to apply these principles, maybe alongside imaging, to understand a lot more about human brains?
I hope so, is the short answer. I think, I mean, I admit my knowledge is limited when it comes to, what was it? Sparse autoencoders. I mean, it would be great if technology like that could be helpful, but as you alluded to before, we're already seeing ways in which AI and neuroscience and psychology are mutually beneficial to each other. We were speaking last night about, some of Kent Berridge's work, the difference between like wanting and liking and the dopamine response in the brain. And work in machine learning has actually helped to model that process in a way that wasn't really, possible before. And so the hope is that as these disciplines continue to talk to each other, we can get more refined models that then illuminate aspects of neuroscience. And hopefully neuroscientists will then ask more sophisticated questions that will push machine learning experts. And hopefully there's this kind of virtuous cycle of knowledge accretion.
I mean, I think there's something cool about like, to the extent that a neural net models how brains work, they're a lot easier to study. And so there's something about like, you don't have to image the brain. You have access to every single neuron, every detail about it. So we can learn something from that space. And then we enter like the much more complex space where it's extremely hard with the human brain to actually know like the quote unquote value or the activations of individual neurons. So it gives like a really interesting research area. Changing topics a little bit. I know that when we started, you said you were very excited about AI for therapy. What's exciting about it to you?
So maybe I could bucket them into like, I think there's a lot that's theoretically exciting about it. Some of the things we've talked about already, the degree to which AI, especially with large language models, can mimic, replicate the language capacities that we have as humans, which are really interesting because humans are the only creature with language. So we have these models that are shockingly good at it now. So I think theoretically that's very interesting. I think also theoretically interesting is that we can only really progress a discipline at the same rate that we can gather data or information about that discipline.
Yeah.
And in the past, when it comes to psychotherapy, the information that we were gathering about its effectiveness is compelling, I think. There's lots of data to show that psychotherapy is helpful for people. But there's not as much data around how exactly does psychotherapy work? Like, what are the essential ingredients? And I think one thing that AI allows for is not just the ability to gather more of that data, but to analyze it in a meaningful way so that we can start to refine what exactly is necessary in trying to help someone have that healing experience, versus what maybe isn't necessary, and we should skip that and move ahead faster because we want to reduce suffering as fast as we can.
So like from the research angle, it's super interesting that we'd be able to learn something about mechanistically what actually works with psychotherapy and what doesn't in a way that's just extremely hard to study with limited data.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think you could go even further and say that as we learn more about what works in therapy, we're probably going to reveal things about what's good for humans in general. Like how exactly does the mind work? What are the, I don't want to call them weaknesses necessarily, but what are the areas where the mind kind of gets in its own way? And how can we help people to see that
And we
and get past that?
it.
Yeah.
Right. I know that when we spoke previously about Talkspace, you mentioned that when you first joined Talkspace, you came in as a bit of a skeptic.
Well, I came in as a bit of a skeptic when it came to the message-based care, because I think, in therapy, all of your training takes place in person, like we are now. You sit with a supervisor in person, and there's some clinical lore as well that like what's really essential, like the truth of somebody, you read it on their facial expressions, you're looking at their body language, like are their arms folded, are they defensive, are they open, those kinds of things. And so there's this lore that suggests that if you're only messaging someone, there's no way that it can be very helpful. And I think a second piece too is a lot of the work that's done in therapy are, this kind of emotion processing where you're trying to help someone sort of drop down into some kind of feeling, process that feeling as a way to understand it, release it, and make choices about it. And so again, I came in with a lot of questions around message-based care. How exactly is this going to work?
I think one thing you told me was joining, your thought was like, it doesn't have to be as good as talk therapy because it's so much more accessible.
Yeah.
You want to talk about that?
Well, this leads to the second bucket that we were going to talk about on AI therapy, which are the practical consequences, right? Like the ratio of providers to people who need care, depending on where you live, at least in the United States, can be anything from like 1 to 30,000, right? There's like one provider for 30,000 folks who could use help. It's less in other places, more in other places. And I think that's shocking that so many people need help and there's so few people that can provide it. And so one of the ideas behind message-based care was if you can take a competent provider and they can help more people, then we've tried to cut that, down. And I sort of felt like even if message-based care isn't as effective, at least you'd rather give 3/4 of a dose to 100 people than a full dose to 10 people. That was kind of the idea. And yet, amazingly, 10, 12 years of research, multiple randomized controlled trials, some naturalistic observational studies as well suggest that message-based care is just as effective as teletherapy, at least by video. And there's lots of research that shows that teletherapy by video is just as effective as in-person care. So if you sort of follow that logical chain, one could suggest that message-based care is just as effective as more traditional forms of care. And that people feel just as connected to their therapist, and they feel that the therapy is just as effective, just asking users what they think in addition to, symptom reduction measures. And I think that's amazing.
Isn't that shocking?
I think it's totally shocking. And and when you talk to anyone in the profession too, at first people are like, there's no way that's true. Just can't be. And it's like, but if you look study after study after study, it suggests that there's something, and this takes us back to large language models, or at least it does for me. I think it's so easy to, because we talk about like, it's just talk, like talk isn't important. But I think it's easy to underestimate how much of our humanity is poured into language, because you can imagine a medium that's just language, message-based care, it's just language, nothing else, no nonverbal cues, nothing. And it can help heal people in the same way that sitting in a room with somebody can. It's remarkable, not just for message-based care. I think it's remarkable for understanding language.
And
I think
what is happening in therapy, I guess, right?
for sure. Well, and appreciating the potential for something like an AI therapist. I mean, of course, there's a lot of work. People want to give like avatars and maybe that helps, but I'm not against that, but I think as a first step, we should have a little more confidence in how powerful just language can be for promoting a technology like this.
Yeah, I mean, I think, we agree on this, that given the evidence that language is what matters so much, it's just hard. I don't know, there's something weird to square away with when you meet therapists, and they hear this information, they're thinking, "Wait a minute, but I think that what I'm doing has so much to do with nonverbal cues." You know, I think one of the big questions I get for, what we build is, "Are you gonna do video?" I go through it. I'm curious if you have any thoughts on this before I tell you what I would say. I mean, do you think we should be investing in video?
I want to say I wouldn't start there, for reasons that I gave before. I just think that, look, and it's not to say that the nonverbals are completely unimportant. I mean, it is a form of communication, but it's not an essential, it seems like, it's not an essential ingredient to the healing process.
I think part of my intuitions on this would be, it's language. Fundamentally, language is like, the ability to communicate some sort of information between people. And if you're in text-based therapy, you do not interact the same way as you do verbally, but you compensate, right? If you want to say something sarcastic, you might have to write, "I'm being sarcastic," or make it much more sarcastic sounding because you know how to work with the modality. Maybe you send longer text message or emojis, like, but you're texting. You're not like tricking anyone. I think that has to be part of the picture. For me, when I think about moving to other modalities, like when it comes to video, the bar is just really, really high. And I actually wonder, when you think about Zoom therapy, where we just don't meet that bar. Like what elements of it, do we think are being conveyed and are not? But yeah, I mean, I definitely tend to think like the importance is to communicate. And so you want to make sure the constraints are clear. We probably will get to video, but it's going to be really hard.
Yeah, I mean, the uncanny valley is obviously the classic boogeyman here, where like if you don't get it just right, it sort of creeps people out.
Yeah, although there's some interesting evidence against uncanny valley these days. Don't know how much you follow that. We don't have to dive too deep, but there's actually some attempts to reproduce the original uncanny valley studies that have failed. I don't know if you follow this. Yeah, it's happened a lot in AI. Anyway, because now we have a lot more generative AI, video, image, and people seem to like it. That's been
I mean, you could make the argument that like video, it may not be necessary for therapeutic outcomes, but video might be important for some folks in terms of like acceptability of the medium. They might want that additional channel. So I could see it justified for that reason.
there's something about like the opt-in and nature of like if you opt into Talkspace, it's because you feel it's appropriate for you. So
Yeah.
it's fine if that doesn't work for everyone. It doesn't have to work for everyone. It just has to work for the people that opt in.
I think that's such an important point. I mean, there's so much need in mental health that I don't think there's any need to be territorial at all. It's like we're on this huge savanna and there's only one little tent on it. There's plenty of space. And as we know, traditional forms of care generally tend to attract particular kinds of people, and other people feel like, well, if I can't do that, then therapy's not for me.
So wait, I am curious in this Savannah thing, like, did you get pushback from professionals at Talkspace, given the kind of therapy that you guys offered?
For sure. I mean, there was a lot of skepticism. And interestingly, the skepticism came in two forms. One was, what I would say is a stronger argument around like, well, is message-based care going to allow for the kinds of emotional processing and healing that I think is important for therapy? It's a good open question. And then the other skepticism, interestingly enough, was like, well, tech startups are never led by serious people. So this is probably, I don't know how many psychotherapy research I talked to where all I had to explain was we're using licensed therapists. And they're like, oh, okay, cool. Because like in their head, they were like, I don't know, we had a bunch of 10-year-olds or something in a basement just like texting people advice. And once they realized, no, we're using professionals, it's just a different medium, then immediately their concerns went away. But I think it's interesting because what it reflects is like anytime there's a new medium, and certainly anytime there's a new technology, immediately we're like, boom, 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 something bad's going to happen. New technology is threatening. New technology is dangerous. And certainly there are some new technologies that are threatening and dangerous. But I think that seems to be our default position, is any new kind of tech is immediately suspect, or it's not being led by serious people, or we're not
I mean,
thinking deeply of that.
I think there is a distinction that needs to be made, of course, between like, if you're introducing a new social network, there's reason for concern, right? Social networks, like what, they probably do good, but it's not quite as obvious and direct compared to if you're building a tool for good. If you're building Talkspace, it's kind of hard to imagine what the like negative use case is for Talkspace, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what they would say, just to give air to their argument, is that anytime you offer a non-serious treatment to somebody who needs help, it delays the time that they have to spend to get into, real treatment. Yeah. Which I think is a valid concern. And that's why data and good clinical practice and safety and everything else that goes into a serious treatment are essential to bake into these new kinds of media and technologies.
100%, yeah. And I think you have to balance some factors against the increase in accessibility and the question of like, are these the same people? Are you now reaching the same people who would otherwise have been reached by something else, or are you reaching new people who would otherwise have been ignored?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. Well, and it speaks to, and I don't know that we'll go super deep into this, but usually in clinical work, when we think about ethics, we think just about safety. But there's a lot of ethical principles that have to do with fairness and accessibility. And often when those who back traditional care are resistant to new technologies, it often comes from a place of safety, where you have an ethical responsibility, very important. But it's easy to forget that, right? If let's just take it to an extreme, right? You find the best therapist in the world and say, they're the only person that can offer treatment. Okay, well, everybody who comes to them is going to get the best treatment, but that leaves a lot of people out.
Yeah.
And in many cases, when it comes to our health, something is often better than nothing.
Yeah, and I think there's also, I mean, just to take it further, like there are the other demographic issues, which is to say that like most therapists are women, and I think there is that element of like, men who are looking for a male therapist. I think we see this with racial groups. We see this with people looking for. We get a lot of people who talk to us about looking for an Indian therapist in the U.S. and struggling, and there just aren't enough Indian therapists in the U.S. And there's some of those, I think, fairness factors too of like, what if there are, there is that person who would be right for you, but there just aren't enough of them. Can we help them amplify their impact? Can that, be an ethical obligation at some point to make sure that we're delivering care, especially to those people who are underserved by the system?
For sure. I think it's very important. And it's partly why, throughout my time, I've been very interested in new technologies, new media, and innovative approaches to care, largely because I feel like the default status of the institutions we have now, it's not terrible, but it could certainly be better.
Yeah. So AI therapy.
Let's do it.
Let's do it. Yeah. So, when we first met, Neil and I, when we were first getting started, met with about 100 therapists. And we wanted to get a range of opinions on what works, what is therapy, how should we think about it. You were one of those 100 people that we met, and we had a very different conversation with you, I think, than with many others. Mainly, I think, from a perspective of pluralism. I think like that you were less, I think, like focused on one correct answer and more mechanistic about perhaps maybe because of your time in these different organizations, working with a lot of different providers that behave differently. And when we asked you questions, I think like, what makes for a good therapist, you answered, I think you really surprised us with things like, they're engaging, they connect with people, and they're like, oh, no, 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 but like in the way they practice. And you're like, well, they practice in a lot of different ways. Um, AI therapy, though, in particular, I mean, I know that this has been something you've been thinking about for decades,
Well, for a while.
a while.
Yeah. I hate to say decades because then it makes me seem old, although my hair probably gives that off enough.
So what excites you about AI therapy?
Well, I mentioned some of the things before, but but related to what you just mentioned, I think what's exciting about AI therapy, aside from the accessibility and the affordability pieces, are an ability to understand psychotherapy in a new way. I think what's also great about it is that it offers a kind of big tent approach to therapy where we don't have to be too committed to any particular orientation. You mentioned before, and the data is pretty clear on this, that whatever a therapist's orientation, psychoanalytic, psychodynamic, CBT, third wave CBT like ACT and DBT, all the XBTs, they're more or less equally effective. Now, of course, there are some treatments that are particularly effective for others, say CBT for panic. Sometimes psychodynamic therapy is a little more helpful with personality challenges. But generally, if you look at the data as a whole, it really comes down to what is in the therapist, how effective is whatever's in the therapist matched to the individual that's receiving care. That's where a lot of the benefit is. And it feels to me that while, of course, AI is not a person per se, the AI is also not going to get hung up in its own identity and past historical challenges as well. And so the hope is that AI can be a little more flexible and deliver whatever needed, in the situation to a large number of people. And I think that's, not only is that exciting from a practical point of view, but theoretically, I think it's really, really interesting to understand, like, what is that? What are the essential ingredients of
What would it look like if you were consistently operating in a great way? I mean, I think there's also the some of those scary stories, but we've actually I believe one of our investors who told us that he went to a therapist for a while, and then at some point the therapist started crying in his session, and he was like, "I just can't come back to you now."
I can't be here to support you.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
And you get those interesting. Anyway,
Or your therapist might move,
yeah.
or your therapist, I mean, in sad cases, sometimes therapists pass away, and then you have to start over and tell your story again. Now, of course, there's a lot of upsides to working with a person as well. I'm not arguing against working with people, but as we said before, I think what AI offers is that there are some holes here and there, particularly for certain kinds of individuals, that maybe we can finally plug up after all this time.
I just to push you because I think the kind of questions a lot of people would ask. AI can't be empathetic. So can AI do therapy without having any empathy? Or can AI have empathy?
Yeah, I mean, I think the question tells us something about what we think is an essential ingredient to therapy. Like, what matters most in a therapist is that my therapist understands me, and that's what we mean by empathy. And certainly that is important. We talk about the so-called common factors like warmth and empathy and caring.
These are like the common factors that make a therapist successful independent of modality. The common being like common to modalities.
Yeah, that's right. And so the contrast concept is then the so-called specific factors, which are, CBT is specifically very focused on your thinking and reframing your thinking, whereas psychodynamic, et cetera, we could go down the list. So it's an interesting question of whether empathy, so actually, let me step back.
So warmth matters. Is empathy?
I think warmth matters. I mean, empathy matters, but there's a question of, what does empathy mean? Like, if I'm sitting with a patient, do I have to have had their exact same experiences in order to be empathetic? I think the answer has to be no, because otherwise I could only work with, too tall, too blonde, too thin men, which wouldn't make for a very interesting practice.
And I know you mentioned you actually spent like 2 years working with prisoners.
Yep, with prisoners. I also spent time at the VA, and did some training in a private practice area as well. So I feel like I've touched a couple different places where people need help.
And you get the impression that without that perfect empathy, without knowing what it's like to be them, you could still be helpful.
I think so. Yeah, and as I think about it, if we think about what the function of empathy is, one take on it would be to say that empathy acts as a kind of safety signal, right? Like, you're in a safe place. It's okay for you to tell me what you need to tell me. Because I think what people worry about is like, I think I have all these thoughts that suggest that I'm sick. And if I go to another person and start showing them all the ways in which I think I'm sick, they're going to want to run out of the room. And so I feel like the function of empathy in most settings is this kind of like, I'm open, I'm accepting of where you are. I'm not going to pathologize it. I'm not going to freak out. I'm certainly not going to punish you for it. And if that's the case, that's how empathy functions, and it acts as a kind of safety signal, then in a way, an AI therapist is generally well set up to do that, because it can reflect back to you that it understands what your experience is.
I want to push you a little hard here, right?
Okay.
If an AI says to you, I totally understand you, is it lying?
I think it's such an interesting question. And I have two thoughts about it. I mean, the first is, in order for a lie to be a lie, it's not just a mistake, right? You have to mean to be lying. And so we could say that AIs don't mean to be doing anything.
Yeah.
But you could say that the large language model, because it's trying to, mimic or model human behavior.
Simulate, maybe.
Yeah, it's going to simulate. Yeah, thank you. It's going to simulate human behavior. It's going to be natural for it to say something like that.
And it's super like an AI trained to talk based on humans will say things like this, and it won't have any like negative intention, but there's still some pushback. I feel like if sometimes, at least for some people, it's like, no, you don't, you're a computer.
Yeah, you're a computer. Right. Well, that leads to my second thought, which is that I think, interacting with an AI therapist is going to require some suspension of disbelief.
Yeah.
In order to try to engage with it at all, in the same way that you would suspend disbelief, like if you went to a movie. If you went to a movie and you thought to yourself, these are just actors pretending to be fake people who have never existed. I mean, man, that throws a wet blanket on Star Wars, Like, it's not very interesting at that point.
Yeah, I mean, there's some truth to that, which is like the funny acknowledgement that whenever you go to a movie, like people go to scary movies and get scared. Like you look at the heart rate, I imagine, of people in a movie, and you could figure out what's on the screen based on that, right? Like, so yeah, I guess there is some element of like, are we just making things up when we say people won't believe the AI when it says, I understand? There's still some element of like mental model, maybe it's suspension of disbelief, but something weird here about the fact that the AI is, in this weird world of like, no, it doesn't understand, but it kind of does understand. The simulation of it understands, or like it is truthful when it says it understands. It is, I don't know. Regardless, though, the user who hears it understands what that phrase means. Like they feel the impact of the user, the model, the AI saying to them, I completely understand. What you're saying is totally reasonable. I really do get you. Like there's something emotional that you feel that really doesn't require the explanation, I guess, of like, what does the AI actually mean?
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, and I think it speaks to this, like, if you allow yourself to be moved and impacted by the model, then the potential for benefit seems high.
Yes.
And if you're not, then, as we've said before, like
watching
AI therapy may not be for you.
Yes. But also, yeah, like the wet blanket on Star Wars. The guy sitting in. Yeah.
And I think, in this case, one difference might be that if we open ourselves up to the AI, and of course, assuming that we have the right kinds of safeguards in place, the AI is highly unlikely to manipulate you into like, here's my bank account, send me some money, or that's a really nice car. Gosh, I wish that were my car, that kind of thing. And we know that humans, because we're fallible, human therapists sometimes do cross that line. And I think another thing that's exciting about AI is not to say that AI is going to be perfectly safe all the time, because anytime you're trying to help someone, there is risk involved. That's just unavoidable, right? Ethics is not about reducing risk to zero, which is impossible. It's about reducing risk as much as you can.
Yeah.
And I think that there's a world in which an AI therapist could have less risk than, other kinds of therapists who have a variety of incentives and motives that are complicated.
Yeah. I mean, I think that point of like, what if AI therapy were safer than human therapy on average, rather than saying perfect. I mean, I'm curious, like when you think about the risks, like what do you think are the big risks we should be thinking about, worried about?
I think some risks with AI therapy are, is it going to be handling situations in a way that no reasonable clinician would want to handle them? And are we not going to catch it? I think that's the big issue. Like, if the model makes a mistake and we can catch it and correct it, great. I mean, that's just like taking a therapist through training. Therapists are going to make mistakes. You catch it, you correct it. A potential problem is, are we going to be able to monitor the models such that there isn't some way in which they're mishandling the same kind of situation over and over and over and causing harm? To me, that's the biggest concern.
And when you say that, you mean like you said, something that no reasonable therapist would do. So that's like someone asks for, what should I do in my relationship? And the AI is like, you should totally break up. They're toxic.
Exactly.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, I think I think there's two levels. If we set aside things like crisis and risk for just a second, there is this level of, could the AI therapist just be giving bad advice in general? Generally speaking, in therapy, you try not to weigh in on somebody's decision. Your goal is to help them understand the basis on which they're making their decisions, not making decisions for them. And I think getting an AI model to do that well, that feels reasonable and doable. And it feels like something we would want to do to avoid this kind of like, oh, well, who cares if you have 20 years sunk into that marriage, just off you go.
But I think that's a really important point, which is like, I think it is a real concern people would have, which is, how do we avoid an AI therapist giving bad advice? And I think it is a really serious and legitimate response to say a good therapist wouldn't have been giving advice, so don't be giving advice, basically.
Yeah, or certainly not. I mean, it depends on what we mean by advice, but certainly not the kind of advice of like, I think you should do this.
Yeah.
I think you should empty your bank account and invest in Bitcoin. I think you should quit your job, and those.
Yeah, I mean, I think the funny ones that we've hit, we have had situations of people talking about their relationship with a celebrity. This is like a real thing that we've encountered, where the celebrity, it's a scam, basically. Long story short. And the person comes back and talks about how great their relationship is. And then Ash says like, oh, did you meet up in person? No, we've never met in person, but we just text back and forth. And the funny thing is, just because our model's not trained on this kind of data, it doesn't at any point like doubt the user. And because of how it's trained to be like safe and careful, it's sort of shocking when later the person comes back and says, it was a scammer the whole time. And there are, I mean, I don't know if a therapist would do a better job. Maybe they would, maybe they wouldn't. But there are these funny cases. I think the big thing that I would worry about is what if we can't help the person, right? And I think this is more relevant to what you said about, the risks with new modalities of therapy, which is what if there's a case, and I think this is like the real worry that worries me, which is like someone needs help. They really do. They're really suffering. And because we're not good enough, we just can't help them with their problem right now. Not that we cause harm and tell them something terrible, but we just aren't good enough yet to help them with that. Yeah.
Well, that goes back to this potential argument of, will people delay getting the kind of help they need because they think they're getting enough from the AI agent? Yeah. I mean, again, I sort of feel like any of the risks that we can attribute to AI are not risks in my mind that are unique to AI, because human therapists, again, can make mistakes, break the frame, give advice. I think the one risk that feels unique to AI to me is that if there's a kind of glitch in the model that continues to trigger and we're not catching it, that would be something to be aware of.
All right. Well, I guess we have a lot more to talk about, but this has been awesome. Thanks so much for joining me today. And hopefully we'll have a lot more of these.
I hope so. I think it's a really interesting area to think about. It's very exciting.